So good afternoon. Welcome to our panel on payments regulations, challenges and opportunities. So we have today on this panel three esteemed speakers on this topic. Firstly, on the extreme left, Wong Nai Seng. He leads regulatory strategy for Deloitte in Southeast Asia. We have in the middle Jakub Zazuski, who heads growth of Revolut in APAC. And last but not least, Sherry Goh, country manager for Luno. So as we all know, the Payment Services Act has been in the making for 3 years. So, we're having a chat with Nai Seng, as to when it all started. And I think it started in 2016 where this idea, of the new Payment Services Act was discussed. So finally, after sort of a few rounds of consultation and discussions with engaging the industry, the Act was finally passed in January 2019. Since then, consultation paper has been issued and further feedback received. I think the responses for these feedback are pending, and we expect this by the end of the year. And generally, sort of general industry and expectations is that the Act will be effective from early 2020. So maybe my first question to the panel will be, how are these payment regulations in Singapore and perhaps elsewhere in the region, similar regulations in the region, transforming the marketplace? Perhaps I can start with Jakub, since you have the mic.
Sure. So I think we're very happy with the upcoming Payment Services Act. We see it as a step in the right direction. We want to make sure that the standards are set for everyone equally, and that it's very clear what needs to be done in order to provide different types of payment services that are basically listed as an activity under the Payment Services Act. So we see a lot of similarities when it comes to AML, CTF, what we're also having under the EMR in the UK. We see a couple of differences as well when it comes to different ways of mitigating different types of risks that MAS has seen. But I think from our perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense, because what we really don't want to do is we don't want to operate in some sort of gray areas where we always have to go to great lawyers and get opinions about things that is not really clear. I think whenever it's set and done, and I think from MAS's perspective in Singapore, it was done, as you mentioned, through ways of different consultations. It was, if anyone had a very strong opinion about a particular topic, it was very easy to actually feed to the MAS. So we really appreciate that. I think we really appreciated also a series of events that MAS had when it comes to kind of showcasing in more detail about different payment activities under PSA, where also everyone could give feedback. So I think having that sense of community and having that sense to always be heard is something that we really appreciate. And as I said, I think it's from our perspective, it's just the beginning. Knowing that we're very happy that hopefully in January the Payment Services Act will come into force. But we think that there's still a couple of things that throughout the journey where different companies are going to be licensed. There'll be more and more things that are going to be coming, and then I'm sure that, as you know, MAS has left some doors open when it comes to interpretation, or when it comes to kind of seeing more data, seeing how the market behaves, and then adjusting on the way. So I think we really appreciate this kind of way of conducting or introducing new licenses, and as I said, I think it sets a good standard, and this is always why we were. We always wanted to let MAS know that, in our opinion, it is the MAS that sets the standard for the whole region. So that's why, knowing how it's going to be structured in Singapore, we hope that when it comes to the diligence in which the PSA has been put together, is going to be a great standard for other countries in the region. And that's why it's going to be easier for us, or easier for other companies to expand internationally, knowing that the requirements are pretty similar and highly influenced by what MAS has done with the PSA.
It's a really good point, right? The point about having clarity in regulations actually helps growth, right? Rather than, And perhaps, Sherry, do you think that will sort of change the marketplace to a great extent in the region?
I think in general, with any regulations, it puts the sector towards a very healthy development. I think we can all agree that in the past years, we see a lot of new business models coming out, new activities coming up. I think in general, innovation is great for consumer, but it's also putting consumer at more risk that they are not realizing as well. So I think with regulations, it actually set the right guardrails to make sure that all this innovation takes place in a very healthy way, and make sure that all this innovation will ultimately benefit consumers without putting them at like unnecessary risk. Yeah.
Anything to add to the?
So I'd like to echo the views from Jakob and Sherry earlier. Really, the approach that MES has taken is one that's very risk-focused. So where it identifies that there could be particular risks, whether it's in terms of AML, CFT, in terms of technology risk or user protection, it has put in place some guardrails to address those risks. And then where I think they want to see more innovation, allow for more experimentation, particularly for the smaller companies with a smaller reach. They have allowed for greater flexibility. And therefore, I think that's possibly an approach that maybe some of the regulators in the region may also be considering taking up as well, as they look at sort of modernizing their regulatory approach. I think this issue of modernizing the regulations will be an ongoing process. As you said, all the new business models that are sprouting out because of technology, because of consumer demands and so forth, that will create more and more innovation and at a faster pace on an ongoing basis. So certainly a very exciting time for players like yourselves.
Yes, most certainly, and maybe to sum it up, basically, we think that regulations are great. A good, rigorous sort of process around engaging industry is fantastic, and of course, being flexible, right? Modernizing regulations help sort of different types of players come into the marketplace, right? So it allows for different players to come into the marketplace, which is very interesting. So I guess frequently, when we talk about this topic of regulations, albeit it's great for industry, it promotes, more different players, it ensures consistency, it protects the consumers. There's always this discussion around challenges, right? All good regulations, right? There always come challenges. So what are you, I guess, maybe Sherry, finding in terms of trying to implement the regulations? What are some of the key challenges that you are facing?
I think with any new regulatory introductions, there'll definitely be some kind of implementation challenges that we have to look at. And I will see them as teething issues that we have to overcome. So I think what is important for companies like us is to make sure that we do a very thorough review of our AML policies, KYC policies, just to make sure that we can actually meet the requirements that are set forth in different local markets. So I think a good thing that Luno as a company has done is that we have made sure that we voluntarily set good standards and high standards in terms of KYC, AML, and CFT. So I think there are some changes, but it's not too much. And I think these are things that we have to do and ought to do as responsible players in different local markets. But as a general point, I think the challenges that we see as a global company is that we do see a lack of unified approach in terms of how crypto regulations are being introduced. And I would also think that this is something natural for especially new regulations that are starting to form, especially in the area of crypto. So, different markets will have their own way to see how they want to regulate crypto. So for instance, Malaysia see crypto as securities, Indonesia see crypto as trading commodity, and Singapore, it depends, right? So all these differences are things that we have to look and analyze properly to make sure that we have the right requirements in place. But with all these differences, there will be some form of overheads and costs that will be incurred to make sure that we can make do with all these differences and make sure that we can actually function properly in the local markets. Yeah.
Jakob?
We don't see that many challenges. I think maybe one challenge that we see is the tight deadlines, knowing that there's still a lot of things that we hope that MAS is going to get back to everyone on, especially when it comes to consultations. So knowing that consultations were since, already good couple of months, and we have not heard back, and knowing that PSA is coming in January, which leaves us if something changes for what has already been set in the notices, it might not give us so much time, but we're already assuming that not much will change, and if it changes, what we're going to do is we're going to set a very high standard, so we already adjusted. Having said that, as I said, I think from our perspective, we see the changes are for the good, and this is something that also it's a good standard to have globally. So what we do is given Revolut is licensed across different jurisdictions, we take best standards from all of them and make sure that basically we create a Uber standard that makes sense, and it will also help us a lot when it comes to speaking with the regulators. And in case of doubt, we always are saying that we are having the kind of security of our clients always on the top of our priorities, and this is kind of reverse engineering from that, assuming if we're doing something, what are the particular risks around it and how are we mitigating these risks. And I think having this approach that it's something does not have to be written explicitly in order for us to kind of make sure that the way that we're operating is secure is something that is going to be allowing us also to create a case in case of doubt. But as I said, setting high standards and making sure that we reverse engineer from the client's security.
Do you find that if you are trying, and again, right, just sort of general question, when you are trying to set the highest standards, right, does that make you less competitive in the marketplace?
No, not at all. I think I think competitiveness should never come at the cost of compliance, and same for speed. I think from our perspective, it's something that is compliance first. And even though we're growing like crazy, I think it's not because we are sacrificing anything on the regulatory side. I think this is a given. This has to always come first. And even if we decided to do something that is not following this rule, it would come back, or it would bite back sooner or later. So what we're trying to do is, if we build solid fundamentals for our operations when it comes to product, when it comes to compliance, this is something that it's then going to help us scale faster.
Yeah, good points. So maybe move, leveraging on your last point about building good, strong sort of compliance or risk management allows you to scale faster, right? What do you think are other opportunities that regulations bring? I say.
Well, I think the regulations, by opening up the market, will certainly introduce then more players, potentially more competition as well. And certainly, I think for these players, they will have to think of new ways to attack the market, find niches for themselves in order to thrive. So these are areas of opportunity for the players as well as for consumers as well, right? How do they identify areas of value to consumers? What are the things that consumers value that players can deliver to them? So looking at payments not just as a thing in itself, as a service in itself, but actually leveraging on the payments data to think of new services that can be offered to the consumers. That may be one way to go. I think related to that of competition is also the issue of interoperability. As more and more competition takes place, there's the risk that the market may become fragmented. And then how do you address that challenge for consumers? Having, for instance, multiple QR codes facing them at the retail stand. So these, again, are opportunities for players to come together, to collaborate, and actually to develop solutions that actually meet the customers' needs, while at the same time they maintain their capabilities to compete in the market.
So, Sherry.
Yeah, I think to an earlier point that Jakub made was that I think with regulations, it puts us all on a level playing field. And it only makes sure that good and responsible players are playing in this field. I think as a result of that, it also makes the whole sector as a whole, we can actually sharpen our quality of our services and offerings to the consumers. And again, this actually benefits consumers ultimately. So that's one. And then I think next is also with the regulation, trust and credibility of this kind of services that we are offering will definitely be built. I mean, not just with consumers, but also with business stakeholders. So I think as a whole, this will actually propel the payment service providers towards a better, like a more progressive development. And I think it's really exciting to see what opportunities can really come when the act is in place.